Hello guys, Shok and Vestion are back, of course, ready for our world's predictions and analysis here for the PCS representatives and the world, really. And what are you thinking? What are you thinking ahead of Worlds?
Well, it's going to be an exciting one, as always. I think the thing with Worlds, and whenever I see anyone do predictions for it, it literally never goes the way you expect.
Yeah.
Right? You look at last year's Worlds, and it was DRX who came in as 4th seed, climbed their way all throughout the play-ins, and then, managed to take out the whole thing. So I don't know how much credit you can put towards that analysis. And I think another big thing, right, is a lot of the time the meta changes pretty significantly towards from the end of playoffs to when the actual event starts. So that can always play a factor. But I think despite that, there's always a few teams that you look as your favorites, right? And a lot of the time, even if it's not the expected result, right, they don't end up winning, I think a lot of the time the teams you do expect to make deep runs, they often do, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's only a few exceptions, and oftentimes it seems like China are a region that bring in really strong teams and then they fall very far down, which I don't really actually expect this season because it feels like their representatives now are probably stronger than they've ever been. And so that's something to be excited for as we look towards possibly one of the most exciting Worlds we're yet to see. And of course, we can't talk about Worlds, especially being us, without bringing in the PCS teams. And so specifically PSG and CFO. I mean, I know myself, I feel a lot more confident about PSG ahead of it. Of course, they are the 1st seed, but I just think name for name, I mean, you have Jinjia, who was a sub for the EDG when they won Worlds, which is obviously a lot of experience while he wasn't playing on stage. Just being able to watch and practice with the team and whatnot and be there for that experience is certainly going to add a lot to this roster. And I mean, you've got Maple, who's been around since Season 3, so possibly one of the longest standing League of Legends players, literally at Worlds. I mean, maybe you'd compare him to Deft, who his first Worlds was in, I think, 2014?
It was
2014, yeah, a long time ago. And so there's a lot of veterancy. Veterans are on the roster. Veterans are on the roster. And I think that is something to be excited for. And I mean, obviously they got to go through the play-in stage. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. I mean, we'll start with the CFO side of the roster and with CFO, because honestly, it was kind of an upset, the fact they've even made it to Worlds.
Yeah.
They came in, they'd lost 7 straight games in the PCS, even losing to Duish team, who, by the way, only won 1 single game in the entire split, which means you were worried about them. They get into the lower bracket and they just clean out every single series up into the grand finals, where they took it to Game 5 against PSG. And so now, I mean, a lot of confidence, a lot of momentum I think they would have garnered from that. And obviously the time they've had to play together will add a lot to their sort of ability to get further in these best of 3s, which is the starter play-ins. And if they make it to the best of 5 also, it's going to help a lot with that too. So I think really CFO, their side of the bracket is a lot harder. They start with DFM, which I think is a really good thing, because DFM going through some roster changes, Udapon being the top laner for the latter part of summer. Now he's going back to the bottom lane, and they've picked up Apperman as their top laner for DFM. So I think that is a game I do expect CFO to win, and I don't expect it to be too difficult. Although, of course, it can be. I mean, we did see at MSI when DFM went up against PSG, I believe. They almost took the game. Didn't manage to, but I think certainly there's angles where DFM can win, but I do favor CFO for that one.
I think I'd have to agree. And in general, I feel like, coming into this, while we do have more faith in PSG, they seem like they're stronger overall. They seem more consistent. You've still got to remember that CFO did push them, right?
Yeah.
To that 5 games. So I don't feel like CFO are so monumentally behind PSG that they're just going to feel like a stranger to this play-in stage. And I also agree. I think that CFO probably will win their series up against DFM. Is it going to be a clean 2-0? I would say probably not. I think 2-1. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think 2-1 is probably what I'd expect to. But honestly, it kind of, for me, depends a little bit. Like, if the CFO that came into the playoffs turn up, then I think they can absolutely 2-0. And honestly, I wouldn't be too surprised to see it. I mean, Jimmian, especially, I think when he has a good game, he has really good games. I mean, you've seen him probably, a lot of the people that are watching from NA or whatnot. He played in the Challenger scene over there for 100 Thieves, and he had some highlight plays. I mean, Akali, he got a pentakill on Akali, which made its rounds over on Twitter at the time, and of course Reddit. And I think he's a real star player when he comes into his own, and I think the meta is slowly working back to what he likes to play, because while he's really good at the Jace, I don't think he's so good at the Tristana. And I think now that we're seeing a lot more of the likes of Talia and Azir coming through in a big way, I think that favors him a lot. And I think notably one of his most played champions in his career is actually Corki. And with Azir's prominence, there's a possibility that we might even get to see him on something comfortable like that. So I think depending on how the meta shapes out between sort of now and then, if it favors Jimmy, I do think it's going to be even better for CFO, but I don't think they're clean enough to just confidently say 2-0.
No, I think I'd somewhat agree with that, mainly because, like, well, just the PCS playstyle in general, right? It's always been very scrappy. They like to fight over objectives. They like just, fighting as much as possible. And a lot of that heavy lifting for their playoffs run as CFO was from their bot lane, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned Jimmy, who kind of came into his own when it mattered, I think.
For sure.
He was there when he was needed, but it really was the bot lane who was the staple of not just the split, but really, taking home those best of fives, because a lot of them did come down to game number 5, right? I think they played like 3 5-game series, and they had one that was 4 or something like that.
It was 4, but it had a 60-minute game in it. Yeah.
So there was a lot of practice time on stage, if you will, and hopefully that does well for them. I do think the meta could be, pretty different.
I think the jungle meta might be worrying for CF.
Yeah, possibly, because Gemini definitely prefers the tanks, right? And there's a lot of kind of, wouldn't call them weird picks, but stuff like the Bel'Veth that is coming into meta where it feels like this is a champ that if you're not good at, you're probably just going to have to ban out. Maybe arguments that, like, it's not a champ that's really suited for competitive, but it seems strong enough that it's getting played in spite of that, right? So maybe there's a way we can kind of band-aid fix around that. Either way, we'll see. I still have reasonable hopes for CFO, but I mean, as you mentioned at the start, I do think they have the more difficult side of the bracket, because the other teams on their side, it's that BDS and GG versus TW, and I think you expect whichever team of BDS and GG to be the ones who come out on top of that side of the bracket. And do you have an opinion on that sort of match? Because for me, I'm not sure who I'd favor between those two. I think maybe I'd give it slightly to GG, but I don't know too well.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I think I would also give it to GG, but I'm not confident enough to say for sure. And I mean, that's kind of exciting, right? You've got your own little game before Worlds even starts to watch. So, and I think regardless really of who wins out of that one, should take the win over Team Wales pretty confidently. I don't think there's really much controversy around that. And then I think going forward, after they do that, obviously CFO will be against them. And that's going to be the biggest test, not only for CFO, but if they make it to the final, sort of the qualifying game, the best of 5 there, then it's likely that PSG might have to come up against them. And so it could be worrying for not only CFO, but for PSG. And I don't think if it's BDS or if it's GG, you really favor that matchup. Either way, I think it's probably just very similar in many regards. So yeah, I expect, I don't know out of the two who would win. GG maybe is my expectation, and then going up against CFO later on, I can see CFO maybe being able to do it, but it will be definitely difficult. One thing I do want to say before we sort of move past CFO is that at some stage of the play-ins, if they don't make it to the Swiss, but just at some stage of Worlds, I have to see Chelsea on Blitzcrank. I have to see that again. And honestly, if some of you haven't seen it, he is honestly like the new edition of Mad Life. Like, he is making hooks that you'd like, back in the day, you'd see Mad Life pull off these insane hooks. And that is what Chelsea does every single time he locks in the champ. So I really, really hope we see it again. And I wouldn't even be too surprised if they're like down a game in a best of 3 just to backs against the wall just to pull it out, because that's what they're doing in the playoffs, and it was working really, really well.
Yeah, I think I can agree. And I think if you are playing a best of 3, especially if you come up against a team like BDS GG and you feel like you're a bit weaker, right? I think the variance for a best of 3 is fine, because ultimately there's just not that many games being played there. And I think CFO as a whole, they are quite variant, right? Like they didn't cleanly win any of the series they played. And obviously the games against PSG felt pretty messy too, right? Like a lot of them were one-sided one way or the other. And so I think that while I would favor whoever comes out of BDS and GG over CFO, I really don't think it's unrealistic for them to win, right? I think I'd probably just see how it goes on the day, I think.
Yeah, and I think one thing CFO has that PSG doesn't is that most of their players have a random pocket pick where you can't really plan for. Like, Jimian has his Yone, which he often picks. Rest has a bunch of them. Like, the Udyr is obviously namely the main one, but pretty much, like, if you try ban him out, you can't, because he just has some weird pick that he'll pick up, or like just something that you don't expect him to take, he will. And so I think that's really good. And of course, Shun, he's really big on his Draven, and he's also been picking up the Vayne recently. And I think those two are like, they're 80 carries that you don't really look to ban unless you're against Han Summer. And obviously, people aren't probably going to look at the CF. And honestly, Shun didn't play a whole lot of Draven in the summer.
Yeah.
And so it's not like many of these teams would have scouted the fact that, oh, this guy used to have Draven pretty much permabanned against him, and look to be aware of that. So it's something that I think, given the right scenario, it's probable that he can bring it out, especially like just with how aggressive Chelsea often likes to be. It does pair quite well, and against sort of a team that you'd expect to win perhaps out of the BDS or GG, those are things you can look towards, is these less expected pick where teams haven't had the chance to practice against it all that much. And so it can be a detriment, but it can also be something that favors your team, especially in the best of 3, as you said.
Yeah, I think especially after, just because it's been so long since most of these teams have played comp games, there is really the potential to almost reinvent yourself as a team in that time, right? Because especially for the likes of BDS and GG, I don't know how long it's been since they played their matches, right? It's been a pretty long time.
Yeah,
and
months.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that almost all teams come into Worlds anyway looking slightly different, just because the meta changes so much and there's all that kind of prep time before it. But I think now more than ever, you should expect some surprises just because of the huge delay between the two tournaments.
Yeah, so going from the sort of conclusion of this, do you predict CFO to make it to the first, because obviously if you lose, you go down in the losers bracket, so you're not eliminated immediately, but do you expect CFO to be able to beat DFM, be able to beat the winner of the game above them, and then make it to that sort of qualifying spot?
I would say probably not. I think I would still, just percentage-wise, I think I have to say that CFO aren't going to be as strong as whichever team of BDS and GG come through. But I don't think it's like that unlikely either. So I guess if I had to make a prediction,
40-60?
Yeah, I would say CFO fall to the losers bracket, but who knows?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much in agreement with that. I think I can see CFO winning it, and I hope CFO managed to do it and make it to that sort of qualifying spot. But I think it's more likely that it will be BDS or GG, the winner of that, to pick up that spot. And so, I think that concludes that side of the bracket. And should we take a look over at the other side of the bracket?
I think we should.
Yep, so I know on that side it's going to be Gigabyte Marines first versus Loud.
Yep.
And it will be PSG up against R7. I think for the first game, Gigabyte Marines versus Loud, I'm not sure about you, but I predict Gigabyte's Marines to be able to pick that up. I think, looking at Levi especially, I mean, that guy, it feels like he's been a pro player for decades
very long
now.
time.
Yeah, the guy has been around the block, and he has always been sort of, no matter what iteration of the Vietnamese team he's on, it's always been like, look at this jungler, he's amazing. I mean, the most memorable time for him, possibly that Nocturne game where he was level 6 at like 4 or 5 minutes and just got spot is, one of the most heroic games I've ever seen. They've managed to pick up the win in that one, and I think, he's a name that is worldly known, and for good reason too. So I think off the back of him alone almost, you can expect that Gigabyte's Marine will pick that up. But then of course R7 versus PSG, I think this should be a pretty easy one for PSG. I think PSG looked good at MSI. Obviously, they didn't manage to make it out of the play-ins there, but they had some really good games, really good comebacks, and Waku looked really strong. And they've improved their roster now with Maple, who most people around the world will know, of course. He's played in the LPL, he's played in the LMS for years on Flash Wolves, pretty much attending every single Worlds in MSI during that time. And of course, TSM last year, where didn't have all that much success, but a lot of people know of TSM, so he's pretty well known now. And so I think PSG are favored to win that pretty heavily. I think Junji is looking really good. Finals MVP for the second time in a row. Wako still looking strong. And then Maple looking better than Ubel quite considerably. Yeah. And I think the meta right now really favors him because he's got a very storied career on champions like Azir. He's looked fantastic on Jace. And those are just champions that are in meta now. And the team looks really, really good with him playing them. And then I think we should also mention that Arja, when compared to the spring, now to summer, looks really, really good. I mean, not only on the tanks and sort of neutralizing his lane, but he's had standout performances on the likes of the Gwen and just honestly other carries too. And even when he plays things like the tank Poppy, he carries games on it. And I think that is a really good sign because oftentimes the difference between sort of a middle league sort of team and a top league team is having a top laner who is able to carry.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree. And something that I think I've seen from PSG all season long is they do feel quite meta resistant in a way, right? Like they just play very standard picks. They're not really relying on any sort of cheese, pick in their warehouse or on a cheesy play style, right? They really do just play the fundamental solid League of Legends. And I think they're also able to play slow, right? Like we saw that a lot in split number 1. But of course they can play fast too. So I think that I feel very confident in PSG to be able to adapt to whatever Worlds really has to throw at them. And I think you're right. I think you favor them very heavily against R7. The question I think comes in that match after, the Gam versus LLL one, I don't think it's super clear cut. I think Levi if it's a carry jungle meta, probably is favored, right? Whenever I think of Levi, I'm thinking of some of those games where he's playing like Graves and just has like 250 CS at 230 23 minutes. And yeah, I mean, that feels really tough to come up against. I feel like Junjia, though, he's very cut out to deal with that. Yeah. So for me, I would also say Gam probably come out on top over Loud, but I don't think it's super one-sided. I think I'd give that a 2-1 as well. Obviously, of course, it can always depend on the day and how the meta ends up shaping up. And then PSG versus Gam. Do you think that's going to be one-sided? Because I think that I favor PSG in it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. In the past, I would have been more confident in PSG to just be, clean and stuff like that. But I feel like recently, PSG haven't had the cleanest games. And I wonder if that's because CFO just pushed them really hard. And that's now that PSG can kind of see those weaknesses in their play style and they can fix those up. And maybe they come in looking even better than they did before. Or if it's just like the way the meta worked out of just kind of having to scrap and fight over everything. I'm not too sure. I feel like at the moment, it would probably be a 2-1 based off what I know.
Right, I think still it will be a 2-0 to PSG. And sort of the reason I think that is, while they did go to Game 5, obviously, in the PCS Grand Finals against CFO, I think the fact that it was a pretty massive live event, as well as, honestly, CFO, they do a lot early game. They are very, very active in the early stages of the game. I mean, even from level 1, they are really trying to find any advantage they can. And honestly, for the whole year, they've been known as the team to want to start Dragon at 5 minutes. And automatically, when you're sort of doing things like that and finding so much pressure early, I think it means that a game can just be a bit more of a coin toss a lot of the times. And then, of course, something I touched on earlier is also their picks. I mean, some of the games almost felt like, for example, game number 4 of the Grand Finals, if it wasn't Jimmy and Onyon, then it's probably a whole lot cleaner cut, and CFO are probably not favored to win that game. But just sort of the indecisiveness that you gain when going against champs that you're not so familiar against sort of changes how games go. And I think obviously you can have that between inter-region sort of going up against each other. I think honestly PSG feel like they're really fit to deal with Gigabyte Marines. I mean, Levi's obviously going to be the star of the show whenever it's a Vietnamese team. That's just what happens. He likes his carry junglers. But I think ultimately Junji has spent literally this entire split trying to play against carry junglers, and he's been the best jungler in the PCS at doing that. I mean, going up against Kongyue, who is probably the best carry jungler we have in the league, and he was probably the only jungler that was able to deal with the pressure that Kongyue was putting out early, and that's on tanks. Like, that was him playing on the likes of the Sejuani, the Maokai. But Junji actually tends to favor playing carry junglers. I mean, we saw at MSI, he liked the Kazakhs and things along those lines, and the PCS finals bring out the Lilia, looked really good on that. And depending on how the meta shapes up, it looks like things like Balveth might become more open, Viego perhaps because of that, having some more early threats, some skirmishing potential. I actually think that favors Junjia, and I think he can sort of make sure that Levi's not getting too far ahead, as well as it feels like PSG are the best team at dealing with sort of the fact that ganks could be coming. I think the only lane on PSG that dies to ganks almost ever is the bot lane, and that's usually just Woody, and Wako's still okay to pick up sort of the CS or not. And typically, the only lane that ever dies is the bottom lane for PSG. And so I think as long as those guys are sort of playing safe and respectful, and I think generally when you go to an international tournament, you're more likely to just play more safe and respectful. So. I think some of their worries are sort of lessened because of just the nature of being at an international stage. So I think PSG, name for name, I favor them. Obviously, Levi's really strong, but I think Junjia is perhaps better.
Yeah, probably.
And then Maple, I mean, that guy has looked so good in summer. I just truly don't think that PSG really will lose a game against them, and I do think they should 2-0.
Okay, but either way, we have PSG advancing to their kind of qualification match, and so we're expecting, I guess, at first that be PSG versus, I guess, GG is what we'd be expecting.
Yeah, let's say that.
So that's going to be a best of 5.
It will.
Do you think that PSG comes in favored? Because I actually think they might. I think PSG are one of the better teams when it comes to preparing against their opponents, and I think they will have quite a lot more up-to-date data by that point, because I think coming into this, there's probably more information available on PSG recently, right? But I think by the time these games get played, they will be kind of more up-to-date, I guess, with what they need. I'm still not sure if it's going to be... I wouldn't expect a clean sweep either way.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I don't even know that it's necessarily true there's more up-to-date information, because the PCS Grand Finals was on patch 13, 15?
14 it might have even been. I don't know.
I think it was 13. It was 13, 15 or 14, and Worlds is on 13, 19. And so, honestly, there's not that much information. Like, sure, not all of the meta's changed. Like, Kai'Sa is going to be a little bit weaker because the static shiv build's not quite as strong, which means then your mid laners like the Tristana and the Jace lose a little bit of priority because when you can't pair it with that AP Kai'Sa, it sort of means your damage is a little bit lessened. But if top laners are still playing Rumble, then maybe that's not an issue. It's sort of all these things you got to consider. And considering there's just been no pro play on any patch past 13-15, how can you really know? Obviously from scrims, but if you're not scrimming each other, and I mean, the teams at the PCS scrim are teams from China, they're teams from Korea, they're teams from Japan, and Vietnam. It's like, you're going to have a whole different sort of amount of information available to you than when you're in NA and you're scrimming against the Brazilian teams, the Latin American teams, and the North American teams.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes, probably just because there's more recent games, you have a little bit more data. I don't think it should be all that meaningful. And I do think being the 4th seed out of Europe and NA, while that is a major region, I don't think that means they're better than the 1st seed from the PCS. And in fact, I think
it's arguable.
It is arguable, but I do think the PCS 1st seed should, in theory, be stronger because obviously, historically, they've been a good region, of course. And I mean, some of the names are internationally known names, so I don't think it's that big of a difference. And I think PSG probably should be the favorites. Not heavy, but definitely I would favor them. It could be even a 5-game 3-2 or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think I pretty much agree with all that has been said there. I think also something that you might even consider is that PSG have had, the better solo queue and probably the better access to international scrims pretty much all year long. And I wonder how much of that continues into Worlds, right? Because I think if you're an NA or EU 4th seed, that doesn't exactly buy you a lot of good scrims, right? Because just naturally at Worlds, there's a lot better teams to scrim against. Whereas I feel like PSG, one, they're a 1st seed. Admittedly, it's a minor region, but also they've probably built ties with a lot of these scrim partners all year long. And I wonder if that means that they have the better read, coming into this meta. And I think there are some picks that actually could make a pretty big difference for it. So one thing that's been starting to play a lot recently is the AD LeBlanc build, where they're going Shiv, Triforce, Hullbreaker. I think that's something that it's starting to be played in solo queue and competitive, scrims and stuff quite a lot. And PSG were a team that banned Shiv LeBlanc for a lot of this play. And I would say for good reason, because I think AP Shiv LeBlanc was honestly relatively weak after it got nerfed. But that might be a champ that needs to be looked at again. And I really do think when you're coming into Worlds, especially if you are the teams that are playing first and you don't have a lot of information on it, the teams you get to scrim makes a really big difference to what kind of game you show in your very first few series.
Yeah, I think that might even be a concern for PSG, right? Because it feels like the new LeBlanc build tends to be a top lane sort of, a top laner that builds it, and it doesn't strike me as something that Arja would like to play. Like his carry champs typically are the likes of a Renekton, if you include that, and then the Gwen is probably the biggest one that he plays, and Rumble. He's played a bit of Rumble, but outside of that, it doesn't feel like he really likes his carry top laners, and it's very matchup specific. So I don't know that LeBlanc, there's a sort of AD split pushing LeBlanc coming into favor, really favors PSG, but honestly, they've just been banning it all season long anyway, so it shouldn't really affect them if it comes into meta, because they'll just continue to ban it.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess overall we have PSG winning out in that series and then qualifying. Yeah. And so then it'll most likely, do you think it'll be CFO coming up from the losers bracket?
Well, I mean, if CFO lose to GG, they'll then have to verse.
It's going to be versus the winner or the loser of PSG and.
No, they'll first have to beat the winner of Loud versus R7, right? Because Loud versus R7 would play each other, they'd win, and then it'll be against CFO. So I'd have Loud probably beating R7.
I think I'd agree.
I think I'd have Loud versus R7. I don't have much of a horse in the race. I don't. Yeah, but I'd say probably Loud Brazil just seems to be the stronger region than Latin America at the moment. So that's pretty much the reasoning for it. And then them going up against CFO, Loud against CFO. I could see Loud winning, but I also could see CFO winning. I think CFO probably should be favored, actually coming from that, because again, CFO have been able to scrim these international Asian teams from the LCK, teams from the LPL. They've been able to scrim them all year long, and just the access to the better scrims compared to Brazil should mean that you are just favored to win. And I think it's pretty disappointing if you're not able to.
And that's still a best of 3, I believe, right? Or is that a best of 5?
That one's a best of 3, and then the winner of that one will be a best of 5 against the loser of PSG versus GG.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I think it's hard to say between CFO and Lao. Honestly, I'm not too sure who's going to win, but I honestly do think that whichever team wins is most likely going to lose against the team that, loses out of PSG and that BDS or GG. So I would say, I guess overall, my take is that I think it will be PSG who qualifies, and I think one of those EU or NA teams along with them. I don't think it's unrealistic for CFO to make them to qualify, but I think just based off the kind of consistency and based off, I guess, like overall feeling, I don't think they'll make it. But at the same time, it's who knows?
Yeah, I think like almost the moral of the story is, those 90, 50, 10% things. I think that for me, the 90% is 90% I think PSG will qualify. That would be my 90%. The 50%, or maybe we make it like 45 or 40, would be CFO qualify, because I'm pretty confident they can. But I'm just worried about which CFO turns up, because it feels, especially in the summer, they're just so turbulent. It's really hard to be so confident in them. So I'd say like the 50 or the 45, I guess, would be CFO qualifying, and the 10 would be neither qualifying. I think, honestly, one of the teams definitely should.
Yeah.
PSG are the obvious one to pick, but I'd be very surprised if neither of them make it.
So another thing that's generated a lot of discussion this year is this is the first time Worlds has ever had the Swiss bracket. Instead of just going straight into groups, 4 groups of 4, they're doing something different. And there are some pros and cons, I think, to the Swiss stage. So I guess the big pros that people talk about is that, in theory, the matches are higher quality. So the way it works for people at home that don't know is that in your first match, I believe you're randomly placed against just someone else from another region. And then from then on, you should play against teams that have the same record as you. So if you win your first match, you play against other people that are 1-0. If you lose, you play against other people that are 0-1. So the matches are meant to be closer. And I think the other pro that kind of goes along with that is there's a sense of you can lose a few games without being eliminated, and you have the chance to climb back up. So in theory, the Swiss stage means that the better teams get through. And ultimately, the game should be high quality. At least that's kind of what you're looking for. But there are some cons. And I think one of the biggest ones, and perhaps the biggest difference compared to some of the previous Worlds, is after that first match, you are just matched against anyone with the same record, which means there is a very good chance that it's just the same regions playing against each other, right? Yeah. It's not unrealistic to see, Korean, Chinese teams coming out, 1-0 and then just playing against each other and kind of just seeing repeats of a lot of matchups we've already seen, which I think when you compare it to the previous, last, 10 years of Worlds or whatever, you probably will see less, I guess, like inter-regional play, but the game should be higher quality. What do you think?
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think in general, it means that the game should be higher quality. I think there's also sort of another added benefit, is that quite often in the previous Worlds, you'd get to the part of group stage where games just didn't matter anymore.
That's true.
Where there was like one team that was definitely eliminated versus a team that was definitely going through. And so the game just had absolutely no meaning anymore. And that's something that's now avoided. You don't get that with the current sort of format, the Swiss stage format. And I guess one place that can be a problem when you look at this is that it is randomly seeded between other regions, but that doesn't mean it's always going to be sort of more even, because you could get the Korean first seed versus China first seed in game number 1,
for sure.
And then one of them's going to have to lose, and then you could just from then have, say, CFO, if they make it through, going up against JDG, and it's like, well now what? Like it feels pretty doomed if it's like that, because you've just afforded yourself a certain second loss. And so I think, obviously, if you're not meant to go through, you're just not going to go through anyway. So ultimately, it all evens out regardless. But that is sort of an added bonus and negative that can come from it. But I think in general, it's a step in the right direction. I think there are better ways to do it in the future. But I think in terms of the competitive integrity, if you will, for the tournament, this is a lot better than how they did it in the past. And I think it will mean that you're less likely to see a team drop a game, and just that being the upset, that means they are just going to be out of Worlds.
Yeah, I think that's very true. One of your points I want to kind of bring back to is you mentioned, there's no game that I guess doesn't mean anything. And I think while it is better overall that every game means something, there were some games in the past where teams that were already eliminated and kind of had nothing to lose gave us some really exciting matches, right? And of course,
for sure,
some of that excitement is tempered a little bit, right? Just because ultimately for one team, the matchup didn't matter at all. But I don't know, I will miss some of it for sure. And I guess, like you said, it's a step in the right direction. I want to see how it turns out and what kind of adaptations or improvements they might make to it in the future. And honestly, it's just kind of exciting to see something new come to Worlds after so long, right? Because I think while Worlds is one of the best, if not the best esport event, right? Like
Yeah,
just
definitely,
overall, it's
yeah.
so well done. It could use a breath of fresh air.
For sure. I think Riot Production really do an amazing job when it comes to their global events.
Yeah.
I mean, not only looking at League of Legends, I mean, the Valorant stuff they do as well is really amazing. And so when you get here, regardless of sort of how competitive or not competitive the tournament ends up being, it is just amazing to see what they put together. And I think it being in Korea again is also very exciting, because last time I was in Korea was when they came out with K-pop and had the 3D images of the sort of Akali and Kaiser on the stage, and I wonder if they're gonna come up with something again, because after that they had the dragon for one of the
It was
worlds.
2019, I think.
Yeah,
was it?
so they just keep coming out with these new sort of amazing things, and I mean, South Korea is so technologically advanced. Just some ridiculous things going to come out on stage, and so obviously the Swiss stage, it's going to add to that, because it means these games are just going to be that much more exciting, because so much more is going to be on the line for each and every game.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at it, I mean, we got to say, do you think it favors the PCS to be in this sort of thing? Like PSG, we assume is going to go through. Do you think having a Swiss is better for them, or would it be better to have sort of the old groups?
I actually think if you're a minor region, you're probably better off going into an actual group stage, right? Because then it feels like there's the chance of getting a bit lucky, right? And kind of being in one of those groups that has like a first seed from a weaker region or something like that.
Yeah, like NA first seed, China fourth. Yeah.
There's a big difference, I think. So I would say it's maybe a disadvantage, but I think at the same time, it's always been that if you deserve to go through, you're going to get through, right? So functionally, perhaps there isn't as much of a difference in terms of advancing to that kind of, what do you call it, the knockout stage, I guess.
Yeah.
But I do think there is the risk or a higher chance of not picking up as many wins.
Yeah, and I think as a fan, regardless, you want to watch your team go to Worlds and win Worlds, or at least like make a deep run into playoffs.
Sure.
And so really, regardless, if you're going to want to do that, if you want to win Worlds, it doesn't matter if it's a group or a Swiss, because you just have to be the best team in the world. And I think ultimately, like coming in for myself, I'm a big PCS fan now, and I really hope they do well. And so it doesn't matter to me so much what sort of stage it is. I just really hope that either CFO or PSG can go to this tournament and make the PCS and all the fans proud.
So, Vestion, I do have to ask you, overall, for Worlds, who do you predict as the winner? Or maybe your top two?
The winner, I predict, honestly, JDG, I think should be the winner. And I think the two big reasons are called Ruler and Knight. I think those guys
Good reason.
probably look like number 1 and 2 best players in the world right now. Maybe you could argue Knight and Chovy look similar, but honestly, I would probably give it to Ruler and Knight. I think Ruler looks like the best AD carry, maybe best player in the world, and right now it does seem like AD carry is one of, if not the most important role in the game, and I think that just carries your team really, really far into a tournament. I mean, Ruler's won a world championship before and certainly has what it takes to be able to do it again. So that would be my number 1 pick, Gen G being the second pick. I think Pays coming in, he looks really, really good as an AD carry. Obviously, Chovy looking really good. Doran, if he doesn't decide to randomly run it down, looks really good. And so, yeah, number 1, 2. I think if you asked for a third, you could maybe even slice KT in there, but only based off their regular season in the LCK. I think their playoffs was a bit lackluster, but they dominated through the entirety of the sort of summer regular season. So that's, I think, someone you could add into the conversation.
KT always seems like that team that you have a lot of hope in, and they just somehow disappoint you at the end. And I
Year
swear
after
they've always
year,
been
baby.
like that. Yeah. I don't know how it keeps happening, but I guess for my prediction, I would also say it's at least your favorite going in is going to be JDG or Gen G again, because they have just those really strong rosters. And of course, they both won their splits in fairly dominant fashion, right? I think the final went to 3-2 in LPL, if I remember correctly. Not quite sure. And obviously in Korea it was a 3-0 for Gen G, and they looked very dominant in that fashion. The thing is, it's very rare, actually, the team that comes in as the heavy favorites end up winning.
Yeah.
Right? It hasn't actually been like that
never
in a while. Yeah. So
when would you reckon the last time it was?
maybe like
one of the
2016.
I think one of the SKT
Yeah,
ones.
I think maybe 2015. Because since then there have been a lot of
it's just
upsets.
like the number 1 seed of China's like, man, they look so good and get eliminated in groups. It's like, my bad, I guess.
Yeah.
But anyway, continue on with your...
Continue on. Well, I mean, I'm pretty much just reiterating what you've said.
Yeah.
Those feel like the likely ones, and then there's kind of after that, it's, where do you go? Because I think there's definitely some kind of teams that you feel like have the potential to push higher, right? But can you put them as favorites over the ones we've listed? Like, I don't really think so. And I think that while the meta has shifted somewhat, it doesn't really feel like it's shifted kind of in terms of where the power lies, right? It still feels like, I think, bot lane being kind of the big facility, or not even facility, more like the catalyst for a lot of stuff happening in the game. Feels like a lot of it is, if the rest of the map doesn't explode before 2 items, generally once your AD carry hits 2 items, they're the strongest champ on the map. And that's pretty much how it goes. Possibly, you know, with more carry junglers coming into the meta, there's some potential around there, but you don't feel like the game has changed enough, right? It still feels like we're going to see lots of 5v5s around the dragons and, you know, the heralds and stuff like that, and that just kind of lends yourself to, if you're a team fighting role, something like an ADC, or, you know, like a 2-item mid laner playing stuff like the Azir, that can be kind of where your chances to shine. And I guess I don't really expect things to be too different from then on. I guess one thing might be, you know, if there is kind of a sudden shift, because a lot of the time when you come to Worlds, the meta does develop quite a lot over the World's patch, right?
Oh, heaps.
And I think, like, you know, you look like a player, Chovy, for example, I feel like he's got a very deep champion pool and that he can play a lot of different stuff. You know, like his Cassante, for example, feels like it's on a different level to other people. And that's saying something, because Cassante looks good in the hands of a lot of different people, right? So, yeah, I'm not sure. You already mentioned, you know, KT, BLG being those teams that could potentially push higher. Do you think, who would be your dark horse?
My overall, I guess, like, if you go dark horse, like actual dark horse, I think you can't really, I find it hard to mention a Korean or a Chinese team. So I'm probably going G2. I think G2, especially because Caps in particular, he's proven that he can sort of go against the best of them. And even when you don't expect him to do well, he can. So I think G2 would be my dark horse. And I think, obviously, the Caps reason I just brought up, I think Yike, he's probably one of the better junglers in the world at being able to play carry junglers. And even when it's a very not carry jungler meta, he still tries to pull those out. And so I think if the jungle goes ever further in his favor, it could look really good for them. Broken Blade seems like one of the better carry top laners in the world. I mean, you could pretty much put him on the likelihood of like Bin. You know, Bin's a very carry top laner oriented sort of player, and I think Broken Blade is much the same. Han Sama as well, Mickey X, of course. More proven players, and I think honestly they're a very well-rounded team, and I don't see a reason why they can't find the success that the G2 did back in the day when they were going up in the World Finals. And so I think that would be my dark horse. I think you could always also mention T1. I mean, it's pretty hard to, like, if T1's at Worlds, it's hard to not be like, wow, this team could do it all. And honestly, like, the story of Faker winning Worlds for the 4th time, you know, just things like that. It's like, it's sort of, you want to root for them just because of how storied of a player Faker is, how humble he always remains, and just everyone knows the guy, right? So it's always like, I want this guy to win, but it doesn't feel like the team really has it, especially because of sort of T1. As soon as he was out for a couple of months, they got in Pobu, who, yes, isn't as good as a mid laner, but the team around it just fell apart completely. And so it really put into sort of picture just how integral Faker is to that roster, because you can have all the mechanical skill in the world, but it really proved that Faker was there to lead them and really guide them through these games. And without him, they weren't able to do it. And then as soon as he comes back, make it into the playoffs, into the finals, get second. It is pretty mean feat. I mean, and it's hard not to root for him. I don't predict he'll win, but I think there is a chance. There always is a chance with that guy. But yeah, I guess T1 if you want to include Korean and Chinese teams, but probably G2 would be my dark horse. How about you? Do you have differing opinion?
Yeah, I think a little bit. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there with, I think that a lot of people will kind of, you know, see G2 as really trying to reclaim some of that former success, as well as T1 being the team that you don't really expect them to come in and win the tournament anymore, or at least not in their current state. But a lot of people would want to see Faker win again, right? He's a hard guy to root against. For me, I guess my dark horse, and I feel a little bad saying it because it's, once again, one of those Korean or Chinese teams. I think Damwon, you know, DK, feel like they're just a team that always ends up doing quite well. I don't know. I would be hard-pressed to, if you ask me for reasons why they're going to win, I feel like I don't really have them for you at the moment, because it feels like mid-jungle not currently as strong as it was in the past. You know, that kind of duo of Showmaker and Canyon, I don't think they're going to be the ones that just like really put the games on their back, because it's just not really a meta for that. But they've still got strong members around them, right? So I guess I don't see them coming in as a weak team by any means, and they're certainly, if I were looking at 4th seeds, you know, just based off last year, DRX 4th seed come in and kind of clean house. I think
Def's back in the same position.
Exactly, right? I think that's Def's comfort zone, and they could make a deep run from there. And I would like to see that. I think Showmaker, one of the funnier personalities in the scene. And
bringing out the Cassante meme. I mean, that was one of the greatest inventions ever.
Yeah, no, that was really good. So I look towards them, but I feel like I'm not super confident. And they're more like a team that I expect to do damage and upset other people, but I guess I don't see them really making the full run. But I guess to kind of bring it back to what we're here for, how do you think the PCS teams do if they get to this stage? Because obviously we're kind of predicting that PCS make it into the Swiss stage. CFO might, they might not. How do you think they do if and when they get there?
So I think it depends really how the Swiss sort of develops and what teams, because we don't know the draw. We don't know who's up against who. I see a world where PSG can make it out of the Swiss. I don't think it's easy, but I mean, it goes from 16 teams to 8, and I think there is a good chance that PSG could just be better than 8 of the teams. I don't think it's particularly what I expect, but I mean, if the right PSG show up, if Maple's, as good as we know he can be, if Waco's performing like he did at MSI, and if Junjia really steps up, I think there is a world where I could see this team make it into the quarters, and then depending on who they're against, maybe even semis, but probably quarters would be where I'd place them. And can they do it? I'm not too sure. I mean, again, it's really, really hard to predict before we see sort of how the bracket lays out, because, I mean, they might just be up against a Korean team first and then a Chinese team second. And it's like, well, you already got 2 losses there. It feels pretty doomed from here on out having to play perfectly. But I do see a world where it's possible, but likelihood, I mean, I'll give it a 50%. I'll give it a 50% that I think they can make it to quarters. CFO, if they do make it through, I don't think there's much of a chance. I think they can take games up against the major regions. I certainly think that is possible, especially considering there's best of ones. But I don't really foresee them going that far.
Okay. I think for me, I don't think I give the percentage that high for PSG. I think for me, it's more like a 30% or something. I think that it's very unlikely that they just fall down without winning any games. But for me, it's just like when I look, do I think the PSG are better than half those teams? I would say probably not, but with the caveat that, of course, Worlds is a different meta. There's stuff like how well people pay on stage, how well you bounce back from losses. Like, there's a lot of other factors that aren't just, on paper, raw skill, raw team skill. There's a lot of other things that go into it. But for me, I guess I would be, if I were looking at PSG, I think they do have to get a little lucky with their draw to make it through. But again, I don't think it's impossible. CFO, again, I wouldn't actually put them super far behind PSG. I think that while, I think PSG almost benefit from playing more games and just like more consistency, whereas I feel like CFO are the team that, they like that variance. If you just have a couple
best
games,
of one could be.
Yeah, exactly. The best of one almost feels like where CFO would be happy. So CFO, I don't expect them to get through the Swiss stage, but if they do, I'd maybe give them not as high as PSG, still probably like the 15% or something, but their 15% could be real fun to watch. So I guess overall, it feels like a bit doom and gloom almost because, I don't have them that high, but again, it's more because there is just so much variance in those teams that they come up against. You mentioned, if you encounter the Korean team game 1 and then the Chinese team game 2, suddenly you're quite far behind and you have like quite the mountain to catch back up. So I'm not sure. I guess overall, I do hope that the PCS does well because I think that they have shown some really exciting games. I think that if the meta is fast-paced, they should be really suited to that. But I do worry that kind of like what we saw with PSG at MSI, it can feel like if they do come up against rosters that are also like very strong on paper, it's not enough to just be able to rely on, say, like Waco or Junjia to kind of carry the game or put it on their back. They really need to perform across the board. And I think that even when PSG have been, winning their games, a lot of the time, there is someone who's kind of making mistakes, right? Like, while they often have these clean victories, it's not clean from all 5 of them a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that. And I guess one more thing that I think we should maybe touch on is that the grand finals for the PCS was all blue side wins. And do you think that, obviously the meta might change a whole lot between the 4 patches, but do you think that is something to be concerned about when you're headed into this World Championship? Because it really did seem like whatever team was on red side did struggle to put together. Maybe it was the draft. I don't even think it was necessarily the draft, but just the game plan when coming from the red side seemed to just be missing something. And so going to Worlds, do you think that's something to be concerned about? Because obviously in the best of one, if you can only win on the blue side, then if you just roll the red side, then it's pretty like rough to just be like, oh, well, we're losing this one.
Yeah, I mean, I somewhat agree that if there is like a really big side imbalance, then in those best of ones, you're really going to feel it. I guess the problem with it is I feel like a lot of a lot of the PCS teams didn't have as good a red side. Like, I don't think it was just because of side imbalance. I really do think that the approach to the red side wasn't as good. And I think that coming into Worlds, you should have enough time to work on that. At the same time, you were on that patch, 13.14 or 15 or whatever, for a long time, right? And it never really got figured out. So that would perhaps be a worry for me. Ultimately, I guess you just kind of got to coin flip the blue side and be happy with it. And maybe you do favor that, because I think that if you are the weaker team, right, if you're coming up in that sort of stage against some teams that are stronger than you, if it just comes, 50% chance you get the blue or whatever, I'm not sure how they'll do the seeding for that. I assume it is a coin flip or something. Or maybe,
think so.
Yeah, it has to be, right?
I mean, I guess that's coming back to what we talked about before. That's another thing that might be a con when it comes to the Swiss is in group stages, you got both
one
sides.
Side. Well, it'll be interesting. Yeah.
It will be. But ultimately, I think we both agree that we do hope the PCS do very well. And I'll certainly be cheering for them and supporting them as much as possible, because these guys are pretty great. I mean, it's funny to see them. Wako, he's got a bit of a personality on him, that guy. And honestly, most of the PCS players do. Jimmy, I like how he often looks like Einstein. That's my favorite. And Rest, he's going to... One thing about CFO too, by the way, just really quickly, is that Rest actually is playing at the moment, like practicing and doing that for the Asian Games. So I guess you got to worry about how much practice that he can get in, because every other team in play-ins, maybe, I don't know if Vietnam are playing or not, but at least every single other team, maybe not Vietnam, they have all their roster together and continue scrimming, whereas Rest currently would have to scrim for Taipei ahead of the Asian Games.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. I didn't even think of that. Do CFO have a top lane sub as well? I don't think they do.
Not that I'm aware of, no. They have Slaytru, which is the support.
Yeah, right. So I wonder who they're using to scrim, because surely there's no chance they're not scrimming, right? I guess maybe Rest is just playing all of them.
They could use the CFO Academy.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. Well, it's interesting to think about, for sure. Well, I mean, overall, like, it's been a real joy to cast the PCS. And,
for sure.
Seeing some of these players make a deep run at Worlds would be really, really nice. And I am hopeful. I just hope I'm not coping too hard. I do think there is a chance, right? But it does feel like eventually they're going to come up against some roadblock.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely coping too hard. But I certainly just, I feel like you give a bit of sort of hope and, you sort of manifest the success is sort of what I'm going for. And ultimately, I mean, going back years and years, Taiwan has won a world championship.
True.
So it certainly isn't out of the question. I mean, even back then it was, well, Korea are going to win or Moscow 5 are going to win. It was always between those two, and it ended up being Taipei Assassins. So, I mean, we're just looking to reformulate that glory. The glory of Taipei Assassins.
Yeah, he's definitely coping a bit too hard.
Yeah.
But let's see.
Is Arze going to be as good as Stanley the Top King?
Who knows?